Hello and welcome to the podcast. It never rains, but it pours on the BBC. Last week, the Director-General and his Director of News resigned following the row over a Panorama edit of a Donald Trump speech. The US President has threatened to sue for billions of dollars. The corporation has apologised, but has refused to pay any money. Now this week, a Panorama scandal from 30 years ago has reared its head again. The Daily Telegraph, which seems determined to attack the corporation incessantly, has just headed a book review as follows: Did the BBC kill Diana? Referring, of course, to the mother of the Prince of Wales, who was killed on the 31st of August 1997. The book in question is entitled Dianarama, The Betrayal of Princess Diana. The author is Andy Webb, who's followed this story for years. The book focuses on the Panorama interview with Princess Diana, which was obtained and conducted by Martin Bashir in 1995. Bashir unquestionably lied and used underhand methods to get the interview every journalist wanted, and for which he and the BBC received many awards. I and many others believe the princess was determined to give an interview to some broadcaster detailing the breakdown of her marriage and her fears for the future. And I also believe that her death, together with Dodi Fayed in a car crash in Paris, when they were being driven by a drunken driver, was an accident. But was she in that place because of the consequences of the Panorama interview? Earlier I talked to Andy Webb, author of Dianarama, Betrayal of Princess Diana. Andy Webb, welcome to the podcast once more.
It's good to be with you.
And congratulations on the book, which I found, since it has a morass, as it were, of details, or could have had, it's a very good and clear narrative of a very sad and in some ways shocking story. But the Daily Telegraph says, in its headline of your review, did the BBC kill Diana? As a result of reading your book. What's your answer to that?
My answer to that, Roger, is headlines are headlines, and headlines, it's impossible to sum up the full complexity in a headline. Did the BBC kill Diana? Frankly, whether Andy Webb thinks the BBC killed Diana, who cares? I put effectively not that question directly, but a question very similar to people whose view I think does matter, specifically Diana's brother, Charles Spencer. And in the book, because you've had a chance to read it, I think you'd agree he gives a considered and a detailed answer to that question. And Charles Spencer is not somebody who wants to bash the BBC. What he did was he described that what had happened as a result of the Panorama interview, which we can, I think, both agree, was gained in a way that was absolutely reprehensible through means that should never have happened. But as a result of that interview, Diana dispensed with the people around her, the very people around her who had kept her life and a difficult life and a troubled life and a stressful life, the people around who had kept her life on something like an even keel, and most important of all, Patrick Jefferson. Charles Spencer's answer ended in him concluding that because of the course that his sister's life had been set on, the consequences of the interview were, in his word, lethal.
So if I may understand it, then you would write a headline which said Diana would not have died if she had not given this BBC interview.
No, I would write a headline which would be much longer and less snappy than that, saying it could be plausibly argued that Diana would be alive today, 64 years old, the grandmother of 5 kids, had the BBC in April of 1996 or thereabouts told her what they knew. Now, that's not a headline, that's a paragraph, but that's what I would say. Of course, John Burt or Tony Hawk, they weren't driving the Mercedes into the Paris-Alma tunnel. Of course they weren't. If Tony Hall had briefed Diana about what he knew in April of 1996, would her life have followed the course it did? And very, very plausibly, no, it wouldn't.
Tony Hall was then the Director of News, subsequently the Director-General of the BBC. And before I go through the detail of your book and what you've discovered, I want to ask you something about the difficulties you faced in getting actually at the truth, because it's an astonishingly long battle you've waged. And there are 2 issues that really came out for me. One is your difficulty of accessing the BBC archive and the fact that now there is no BBC historian.
Well, Roger, you've absolutely put your finger on something that, for me, I think is very, very worth considering. And it's the second point you made. We'll look at the first one. There is no BBC historian. I mean, I'm going to pat myself on the back here. That is a story I was able to turn up literally in the last few weeks after my book had gone to press. After my book had gone to press, and I kicked myself for not pursuing this earlier, but very, very briefly, it occurred to me the archives, regarding the archives, this with the archives, have been, well, key documents are missing. So one is allowed to say that they have been weeded. It occurred to me, well, hang on. When the official BBC historian tasked to go into the archives and write the history, what difficulties will they face? I then emailed the official historian of the BBC, Professor Jean Seaton, and to my astonishment, received an email back saying, I'm not writing an official history, and in fact, I don't think there is one being written. And people, what? Hang on. We all know about Professor Asa Briggs, who spent many years compiling the history from 1922 to 1974, 5 weighty volumes. Professor Seaton wrote the volume 74 to 87. And of course, I thought, wow, hang on. 87, 2000, I'll pay 22 quid for that, because what we have there is we have the John Burt years, a very cogent period, and slap bang in the middle is the Bashir scandal. Sorry, my answer, I'm making it much, much too long, but it quickly became clear. Jean Seaton had quietly, without any announcement, and indeed apparently an announcement to Professor Jean Seaton, that she had been, as it were, eliminated from the game. The BBC then said to me, no, we're not entirely out of the history game. We got a chap called Professor David Hendy to write a centenary history of the BBC, which came out in 2022. I had the book here already in my office. I went to it, flipped it. I hadn't fully read it, clearly. I did this time. The most momentous piece of television in BBC history is not in there. It is not in there.
So let us be clear, the official historian, Asa Briggs, as you said, Jean Seaton, carrying the period up to 87, yep, wrote meticulous histories about the BBC. Now, of course, like all large organisations, they don't put some in the archive, and you can't stop some people weeding them. You hope you can, whatever. But at least you would have then an official history. So you're saying there's no official history being written. There is no official historian to write it. And on top of that, as we heard in an earlier podcast, actually, access to the BBC archive now today is being restricted. Now, it's said that's for financial and other reasons. So what, as I understand the present situation is that if you have a specific request, you know a document and you ask for it, you may be able to get eventually that out of the BBC archive. But if you want to go to the archive and search around a particular period, you cannot no longer do so. So that's a real barrier to discovering the evidence that you assume must be there.
It is, Roger. I mean, my sort of delving into the archives has been somewhat different. I can tell you, I haven't sort of traipsed up there with my knapsack, like you go to Kew archives or something like that. I have made repeated requests via Freedom of Information for very, very specific documents, which are assumed that they are sitting in the archive. So that's been my entry port, as it were. And the difficulties that I've faced in getting material from the BBC under FOI are just quite extraordinary. I mean, in a nutshell, the BBC has spent in excess of, and this is expenditure signed off by Tim Davie, obviously, in principle, more than £1 million, more than £1 million of licence fee money has been spent on legal advice to stop me seeing a certain set of emails. So you talk about access, transparency. It's astonishing.
Well, the BBC doubtless would say that they have a duty to protect private information under the law, and therefore they have an obligation to redact material and so on. But I think in the book also you point to this flaw, really, in freedom of information, is that the people who release the information, and therefore who are likely to be most embarrassed by it, are the people who can redact it and black out sections. And it's almost impossible to know why they've blacked out certain sections. Is that your experience?
That's absolutely the case. And in this specific instance, it went even one stage further than that. So much so, the fact was, it is very, very likely indeed that some of the documents that I had been asking for were actually written by the person who then had the task of making that decision. I wonder whether this needs to be redacted or whether it doesn't. It wasn't a case of somebody, a third party, so as it were, sitting in the Freedom of Information office looking at documents saying, should we go that one? Does that one go? Does that one go? No, in many cases, this would have been the person who wrote the document. It's the dealer, the person dealing the card in a game of poker. He or she knows what's on the cards, but you don't. You don't know what you're being given, or indeed why you're not being given it. It's extraordinary.
Right. Well, I'd like to pursue this further, but let's go back. I think we should go back to the event itself. Now, in the run-up to the interview that Martin Bashir obtained, clearly the relationship between Diana and Charles was, if not completely broken down, under massive strain. Just not long before the interview, he confessed in a documentary with Jonathan Dimbleby that he'd had an affair. I don't think it was specifically mentioned, but it was clearly about Queen Camilla. Diana also had affairs, and she'd given tapes to an author called Andrew Morton, who believes that Diana, at the point at which Bashir got the interview, was seriously considering or wanted to give her story, for whatever reason. So the question is essentially why Bashir got the story, got the interview that everybody else wanted, and the means by which he got that. Now, would you like to tell us what you think how he did it? I understand, essentially he targeted Earl Spencer because he wanted Earl Spencer to recommend him to the Princess Diana. He was successful in that, and then he developed a relationship with Diana in which it's impossible to know what exactly he told her. But we think, and you think, know what he told Earl Spencer. Could you tell us what he told Earl Spencer?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Roger. I mean, Martin Bashir, as I say towards the back of the book, one can only, in a rather dark and sinister way, admire Martin Bashir's skills. He was utterly brilliant at what he did, because first he has to get past Earl Spencer, who... Let's remember, he had been a journalist, and a good one actually, himself for 10 years. 10 years when he's approached by Martin Bashir. So he's not a naif in this world. Spencer is thoroughly suspicious of journalists because of the way that he's been treated. But Martin Bashir uses his fakes, his forgeries, these fake bank statements that people will have heard something about, in order to get past Charles Spencer, to get his foot in the door. And he is successful.
Now, these bank statements, and it's quite baffling, were fictional. He got a graphics artist to not forge them because it implied they exist in the first place, but to create something which said that payments were being made to people very close to Princess Diana. And the assumption was, or Martin Bashir encouraged the thought, those payments were because they were effectively informing on her. They were totally fictitious. And then he shows those to Earl Spencer. And then Earl Spencer has a handwritten note. I mean, the problem when you have two people in a room and you only have one person's account is difficult. But what there is, and as you make clear in the book, is a very detailed list of Earl Spencer, what he was told, and Earl Spencer, being a journalist, kept the notes. And these things involved suggesting that Tiggy Leg Burke, of whom Dinah was jealous because she was looking after the young boys particularly, had become pregnant by Prince Charles and had an abortion. Not true at all, no shred of evidence, absolutely untrue. And conversations that perhaps MI5, there'd be a traffic accident, she'd be killed, and all of these sort of detailed things, which are actually disgusting to read. And Earl Spencer, fortunately, made a note about that. And in the end, he says he broadly believed it, and then introduced it to Diana. And then we're not entirely sure what Martin Bashir did then over the next 2 months, but he obviously fed more of this sort of material into the princess.
He did, Roger. Your description there, I'm going to say to you, a distinguished editoress you are, I'm going to say it's 95% accurate. The timeline was really at the point at which Bashir is unveiling these, as you say, extraordinary stories about death plots and car crashes and one thing and another. Yes, Charles Spencer notes them down, but he's not believing them. He's absolutely not 100% believing them, because it's at this point in the timeline that once that meeting, it took place on September the 19th, 1995. Once that meeting has concluded, he told me, Martin Bashir left, and then Charles took Diana on one side and said, look, do you know what? He used their pet name, Dutch. He said, look, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. This guy's full of, forgive me, he's full of crap. Spencer wasn't believing it at the time. The mystery, the tragedy, is that, as I sort of put it in the book, it was two people, brother and sister. They've gone to see the same movie. One comes out saying, hey, Timothy Chalamet, he knocked it out of the park, didn't he? And the other one says, what? He's rubbish. He's rubbish. But what happens there is they hug and they kiss and they head for the tube and everything's cool. In this event, Charles Spencer was fully of the belief that Diana had taken the same, left the meeting with the same thoroughgoing suspicion that he had. But Diana hadn't. And part of Martin's massive skill was to immediately follow up and very quickly work his way into the sanctum of Kensington Palace, the sitting room. And Charles Spencer said something very, very interesting. As he observed that this is a three-way meeting, Charles Spencer, Martin Bashir, Diana. Charles Spencer said that he was sitting back taking notes and watching Diana's reaction, and he describes it as Martin Bashir was sort of playing battleships, if you like. He was throwing stuff out. The Queen is going to abdicate shortly. I see. Prince Edward, then unmarried, has AIDS. Okay. Prince William, 13 years old, he's been given a secret super-duper watch able to record conversation. Okay. But the area where Charles Spencer says that the battleship struck its target was when the discussion turned to Tiggy Leg Burke, the nanny, and the prospect of William and Harry being taken away in a extraordinary sounding, custody battle, etc. That was Diana's vulnerable point.
And we know that Diana was, jealous the right word, but was worried about the fact that Tiggy Leg Burke had a very good and loving relationship with the children, and she feared, relatively isolated as she was in Kensington House, that might be true. And the other thing, of course, which is strange about this, is that she was worried about MI5 security services, I think, spying on her, she would say. And yet, if you looked at it from the MI5's point of view, here is the mother of the future king, on her own, and also starting to associate with, should we say, some questionable people, ending up with Dodi Fayed. We would expect MI5 to keep some tabs, wouldn't we, on that? You
certainly would. With at that point in history, the IRA indeed in London still.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole family, of course, Charles Spencer himself has talked about his difficulty in forming relationship in part because of abuse at school and because of his parents' divorce and so on. Diana clearly had bulimia and other things, deeply unhappy and isolated, and therefore more likely, you would think, to accept stories which to us might have seemed rather extreme and which, of course, were untrue, and which it makes even more disgusting what Martin Bashir was up to. Let's move on to the question of the BBC, as you would see it, cover-up. Clearly, when some of this detail came out, not long after the interview, you can imagine the reaction. Here is the most famous Panorama programme interview ever. I don't know whether it was watched by 25 million people in this country, but some incredible feat. Seen around the world, a major triumph, awards are coming. And then the stories start to come out about the way in which the interviews are obtained. Now, I think it's pretty clear from your book and from everything I know, is that the BBC, shall we say, did not leap into investigating what had happened. But gradually things started to come out. And then you have an investigation which concludes that Bashir, yes, did forge these documents, but that he acted in faith, was in some ways a straightforward person, and that's about it. Now, do you think that first investigation, coming not long after the interview itself, was in any way rigorous?
No, I don't think it's in any way rigorous, Roger. You've used the words there that the investigation concluded that Bashir had, in your words, forged documents. No, it's very, very important. The words that were used by the BBC, and indeed used for 25 years by the BBC, was that Martin Bashir had created what they insisted on calling mock-ups to distinctly convey the impression that some sort of television graphic had been created that, for reasons unknown, then never appeared on television. That was the very, very strong impression that was conveyed in press releases to the Mail on Sunday at the time.
But Martin couldn't give an explanation of why he'd done it. This is what I'm baffled about. If you mock up these things into graphic form, and then you can't explain why you've done it, and they are crucial for you getting the interview, any inquiry is going to hone in on that.
Well, quite. Well, I mean, what to me is baffling is not that Martin Bashir offers that story. What is baffling is that somebody, and specifically Tony Hall, at that point one of the most senior journalists in the UK, what is baffling is that he could even think it's credible that such an explanation could be accepted. Quite extraordinary. The key point for me in the whole of this is I don't think for one moment that at the time, the crucial time, we're now in kind of March, April of 1996, I don't think for one moment that the likes of Tony Hall or the Director General at the time, John Burt, that they had any notion whatsoever that Martin Bashir had been saying the things that we've talked about, the death threats and the car crashes and the James Bond watches. I don't think they had any notion of that whatsoever. What they did know beyond peradventure was that their reporter had commissioned forgeries. He had deployed his forgeries to a member of the public, i.e. Charles Spencer, and he had then lied about what he had done. Now, they knew that had gone down, and that crucial set of facts was not passed on to the watchdog body at the time, the Board of Governors, the people who, as you know, it's their job to sit back, but then look over the shoulders of the executives, the managers, the program makers, to see what they've been doing. And in a very, very controversial case like this, they'd be very interested to know. Now, I have spoken to one of the governors who was at the key meeting, which took place on April 25, 1996, and said, look, had you and your colleagues been told just what Tony Hall knew at that time, what would you have done? The answer came back, and it's in the book. We would have insisted on a proper full inquiry. We'd wanted to know, why did Panorama reporters commission forgeries? Why do they show them to members of the public? Why do they lie about it afterwards?
That governor, by the way, you've named him in the book, is Richard Eyre, the former director of the National Theatre, yeah. I mean, the thing which stuck in, and it's a very complex story, and I have a great admiration for Panorama and Tony Hall in many ways, a very good man, etc., etc. The thing which just I cannot understand or really accept is that the person who has to pay the price for this is the graphics artist. And reading, between the lines, he would have no knowledge, A, that they were forged, or B, the purpose for what they used. He would be carrying out a relatively straightforward job for Martin. Yet he is the man who, Tony Hall, in his report, tells the governors, I think, he will never work for the BBC again. That is awful. I still can't understand why. Is it simply that somebody had to take some blame and that was the easiest one?
My analysis of this would be that the governors they're sitting there, 12 people, the good and the great, there are lords and there are bishops, and they're sitting back there. They kind of have seen, there's been a story in the Mail on Sunday that something a little bit unwholesome has taken place. They want to hear that somebody, somewhere, has been punished for something. Now, yes, they do hear that the graphic artist who made these things up has been, the word wasn't used, but effectively blacklisted. He will never, never, never work for the BBC again. And I think that the way these things work, boards of governors, etc., they'd heard that, well, somebody is going to pay the price. And that was more satisfactory than it would have been otherwise. The key thing to remember is that what Tony Hall and a small knot of BBC managers did know beyond any doubt at that point was not made clear to those governors. And had it been made known to those governors, then we've definitely heard from one of them that things would have been different. I think it's absolutely important to point out here that one may well say, well, hang on, Andy Webb, how do you know about this? And this hasn't been raised before. Astonishing as it may sound, in the inquiry conducted by Lord Dyson in the end of 2020 and 2021, it appears to me that Lord Dyson was, bizarre as it sounds, unaware that this critical meeting had taken place at all. because in his report, it's like 44,000 words. The word governors appears just once in a different context. It's almost inexplicable. And as I offered Lord Dyson the opportunity to respond and one thing to another. It would appear he didn't know that this meeting of the watchdogs had taken place at all.
Well, I think you made clear that Lord Dyson himself regrets that he didn't have assistance in the report, that he conducted everything himself. He didn't have somebody who could go away and devil for the detail, if you like. So what you paint in the book is if you weren't to use subsequently the words cover-up, a lack of interest in pursuing the truth on behalf of the BBC and a desire to shut this thing down, but it keeps coming up again and again. In the last, and you also, the present DG, but he has resigned, you do say that he had an opportunity to really search for the truth, and you say he didn't.
I do, and again, as you've said, Roger, the story is long and can get complicated. But to try and make it as simple as possible, in 2020, I made a documentary for Channel 4 Television that, to a large degree, brought this to public notice. At that time, Charles Spencer emailed privately to Tim Davie, and said in so many words, look, terrible things have happened. I have full documentation back here in my office at Althorp, and you should know about this. Tim Davie replied with a letter, a 900-word email, clearly filed with lawyer input and co-signed by his chief of staff at the time. But anyway, Tim Davie's name is at the bottom. And the key paragraph, which I reproduce in the book, was effectively this. Earl Spencer, you say that X happened. Martin Bashir says that Y happened. And we are obliged to accept what we've been told by our member of staff. That is a paraphrase of what happened, but that is essentially the position.
And the problem with all of this, of course, is that Martin Bashir has not been interviewed.
Well, but can I just, sorry, Roger, the key point to make there, I think, is that at this point, it is utterly clear to the BBC that Martin Bashir is a serial liar. That's what makes Tim Davie's email to Earl Spencer so extraordinary, that the brother of Princess Diana should write, with these really, worrying things. But the reply should be that they're going to take the word of the serial liar instead. And at that point, Charles Spencer simply lost patience. He lost patience. He wanted this to be dealt with in a sensible, grown-up, proper way. At that point, he lost patience and went to the Daily Mail. And as you will remember, it was only 5 years ago, 5 front pages, one after another, as the documentation that Spencer had in his office was spread across the paper.
Well, Martin Bashir was genuinely ill. He had a heart bypass operation. The BBC would say that they had a duty of care to him, and they consistently said that he was unwell and couldn't be interrogated, though you produce evidence that there was, of course, correspondence of some sorts between them and the BBC, but he still hasn't spoken. So today, what are the unanswered questions? And is there any prospect, and can anyone answer them other than Martin Bashir?
Well, no, clearly, Martin Bashir could answer a great many questions, but the unanswered ones that could possibly be answered are this, that I was, again, through my researches, that it emerged that 4 key documents, let's call them the smoking guns, had somehow been removed from the BBC archives. Now, we only can put a number on that the number is 4, because by happenstance, copies of these critically incriminatory documents turned up elsewhere. Now, I think it is perfectly possible and indeed sensible to say, well, look, I'm sure it wasn't just 4. It was maybe 6 or 8 or 10 or 20 documents. For instance, there is not a single document that apparently has survived in the BBC archives involving the then editor of Panorama, you know us, Steve Hewlett. Is it even credible that in such a firestorm that was going on, there was no note of any kind, from the...
It should be said that Steve Hewlett is dead, of course. Sadly. He's a very good journalist and can't defend himself. But as a former editor for Panorama, I do share your surprise that there aren't notes. So would you say to a new Director General when they eventually are appointed, and it may be 3 to 6 months, I mean, they've got enough on their plate, obviously, before then. But would you like the new Director General, when appointed, to actually institute another internal inquiry at the BBC, or maybe even invite you into the archives?
Well, now you're talking, aren't you? Maybe I should be made official historian. How about that? There seems to be a vacancy there. No, I say in the book that I think, in my view, for what it's worth, it needs to be, as every new US president typically comes into office and promises to throw open the JFK files and once and for all we'll show what's in there. Somebody untainted by history, and Tim Davie, I think, clumsily did taint himself with the aftermath of this scandal. The new DG needs to come in and recognize that it's not just pesky people, journalists like me, who, are going to keep making their life difficult. They've got to take on board that there is somebody much more eminent than me who needs to be satisfied that the BBC will tell the truth about this, and that is Prince William. That is Prince William. I mean, he made it quite clear, I think. I kick myself for not realizing just how clear he had made it in that speech, which you will have seen, Roger, yourself, on the May 20th, 2021. He says, to paraphrase, "My mother was let down not just by a rogue journalist, not just by Martin Bashir, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way." Those are his words. These are leaders at the BBC. He didn't say they looked in the right direction, but unfortunately, their view was somewhat misted. They looked the other way. Now, I'm careful in the book to not overstate what I know to be the case, but trust me, Prince William wants answers. And I think when he wants answers, he's entitled to get them.
Andy Webb, thank you. It's a long read, it's a detailed read, but it's a very clear one. And, for somebody who's a supporter of the BBC, disturbing. But are you ever going to give up on this? I mean, your rate per hour on this is probably about a penny an hour in terms of the work you've done. Are you ever going to stop?
No, I think what I'll now do, Roger, is sort of hang up my, put my pencil back in its pencil case. But I will say this, until the BBC does face up to the fact that it isn't going to go away, from a journalist, cynical as it sounds, this is the gift that keeps giving. It's the gift that keeps giving, because any cover-up is wonderful for journalists, because what you keep covering up and a little bit comes out, a little bit more comes out, a little bit more comes out. And the point is, when you mess with kings and queens, that's serious stuff. Those stories don't go away. They don't go away. That's why we're still fascinated, some of us 500 years on, to look back at who was at it with Anne Boleyn and why and when and who did what to who. Trust me, 500 years' time, people are going to be talking about, and I'm not chuckling here, they are going to be talking about why it is that there was no Queen Diana on the throne of England. Who betrayed her? So no. Yes, I'll give up. It'll be the Hilary Mantel of, 25 who can continue the story, if you like.
Thank you, Andy Webb. Our thanks to Andy Webb, author of Dianarama, The Betrayal of Princess Diana. Now, if you'd like to support us and receive my weekly blog where I share my reflections on the week's interview, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Just head to patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. And to make it even easier, the link to this is in the description of this programme. And that's all for this week. This podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a good egg production. Until next time, goodbye.